Hey everybody, welcome to the JDO show. It's been a year, but we are back, and we are back with Mr. Rob Vollmar. Hey Rob, thanks for coming on the show.
Man, it's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Excellent, excellent, cool. So the way that the JDO show is going to work from now on, like I said, we've been gone for about a year, is when I have a guest on, instead of having a free-flowing conversation, two buds drinking a beer, shooting the shit. Instead, we are going to talk about a particular book. So I personally asked Rob on today to talk about a book called Can Life Prevail by Pentti Linkola. What'd you think of the book, Rob? Was it enjoyable?
Oh, yeah, it is an enjoyable book to read. It's you know, it if you're if you're a fan of like Wendell Berry's, kind of um, personal essays that he wrote, these are kind of in the same vein. As a guy who studies birds and has spent a lot of time in the Finnish, wilderness, he has a lot of interesting insights about the evolution of those environmental systems over the course of decades, especially in the kind of post World War II hyper industrialized period. So I think that just from like a strict kind of naturalist perspective, that there's a lot of like interesting observations, um, and then as his narrative agenda becomes sort of more blatantly political, um, through the course of the book. Like the writing is engaging, and his persona, uh, kind of in the work, is compelling even when you don't agree with what he's saying.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that, so basically, to frame it for our listeners, Pentti Linkola is a minor celebrity. Well, actually, I think he's a pretty decently major celebrity in Finland, his home
Yeah.
country. He was born in 1938. I hope I got that right. That's what we say is off the dome. Um, so he's an elderly gentleman. He's lived a very long time, and he's made his money for most of his life as a fisherman, using traditional fishing traps to kind of catch his. And he's also big into living in forests, and the man loves birds. What can we say? Like
He's very into birds.
he is a big bird fan. Not a, you know what I mean. Uh, but
He probably like has to love the actual character Big Bird just because it's a bird, like against his
yeah,
wishes. Like
right,
he's like,
beautiful.
hey, I hate this show, but God, that's a beautiful big bird.
You just like, the rest of the Muppets can be gas, but
That's
Big
right.
Bird's fine. So on that note, this book to me is a collection of his essays from, I believe the earliest one is from 1992, and it goes up until 2002, so just after 9/11. And they're not presented chronologically. Instead, they're presented thematically. And so even though these are actual essays from a real human being, I think that the way these essays were laid out in this book is particularly interesting because to me it reads like a very kind of quiet horror novel in a way.
Yeah. It's like
Um,
he becomes radicalized over the course of the book. Although, as you say, if you actually structured them chronologically, it would read differently. So it's
mhm.
purposeful.
Yeah, it's very purposeful because so the book begins and it's mostly about it's kind of this very sad lament for the loss of Finnish forests, and it is pretty striking. The kind of figures that he gives you for the deforestation of Finland's forests is uh, it's ugly, and the way that he kind of describes the forests of his youth versus the kind of blackened soil of post-industrialized Finland. Um, that's sort of like Batman's parents being killed, right? You
Yeah.
kind of get
Yeah.
the impression that things are beginning to turn with him. And then we move from that. We're moving very quickly because we want to get to the scary stuff. We move
Mhm.
from that to animals, where the man does not like cats. He's not a huge fan of cats. He views them as an invasive species, in addition to the things like the mink and the raccoon that are destabilizing his environment. And I think in particular, the animal section is important because you're beginning to kind of get an idea of of what he considers a life balance to be. And so the cats become this kind of foreshadowing of how he's going to begin to speak of people, right?
Yeah.
As a sort of invasive parasitic species that has to. There's actually a kind of a chilling essay about cats where towards the end of it, he's like, so it's complete, he's complaining it's complete bullshit that you can't drown a bag of cats anymore, right? To just like take care of this overpopulation problem that's kind of killing off all these birds that he loves. But before we go too much further, in the book, there is this distinction between basically what we're trying to do, right, is he calls himself kind of a life protector alternating with a deep ecologist, right? So I know that this is something that you're really knowledgeable about. So can you tell us a little bit about what deep ecology is?
Yeah. So, most people, like most philosophical movements, they have like the theorizing that happens before the term is coined, and then you have the work that sort of emerges from that event, that paradigmatic shift. And so, the work of like Wendell Berry and Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, that sort of formed the foundation of American environmentalism, um, took some really fundamental questions to task about human beings and, their activities in relation to the environment. And so in the early 1970s, there was a Norwegian philosopher named Arne Næss, who coined this term deep ecology. So in order to appreciate what is deep about this ecology, it's valuable to contrast it against what we might call shallow or anthropocentric environmentalism.
Okay.
And that says human beings have to live in this environment. How can we conserve and or protect from the degradation of that environment in order to maximize human flourishing?
Right.
And so if you think about like the American park system,
Mm-hmm.
like I would describe that as like anthropocentric environmentalism, where we're cordoning off these spaces. And yes, we in some cases improve on biodiversity and stop the creep of industrial use or agricultural use, but they are maintained for the essential entertainment or edification of people to go in and sort of selectively occupy these spaces and benefit from that.
Mm-hmm.
So deep ecology basically says that all living things have an intrinsic worth, regardless of whether or not they're useful to human needs. And so it's a kind of philosophical shift from the position of how can the environment be optimized for human use to the environment should be protected at the expense of human flourishing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or at least ambivalent to the to human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been a whole generation of deep ecologists. But what's interesting about deep ecology is that it it asks a powerful question that different deep ecologists have answered in different ways. And the question is, by what means?
Mm.
And so if we have this obligation to protect um, the quality of the environment, um, by what means? By any means necessary?
Mm.
By how do we do this? And so Linkola, his answer is basically, human beings are not rational, and the idea that um, we're going to somehow improve industrial systems or existing political systems to actually solve these problems is also irrational,
Mm. Mm.
because they are in fact predicated on the notion of extracting from the environment in order to produce growth.
Right, right.
And
Basically, this
so,
whole idea that if as long as progress remains a goal, progress in the technological and market economy sense of the word, none of this is ever going to work,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so that kind of leads us to Linkola's controversial aspects. I think he's probably pretty controversial in his home country. Certainly would be controversial here, particularly considering some of the things he says later on in the book. Um, the term eco-fascist gets pinned to him quite often. So can you tell us a little bit? I mean, I feel like those two words, I feel like if most listeners hear those, they might kind of begin to be getting an idea of where Linkola's thought goes. But is there a relation to deep ecology with ecofascism? Like I believe you mentioned off mic a sort of Venn diagram, perhaps.
right. So the thing about ecofascism is that um, it's it's dicey, I think, at this stage to talk about ecofascism as if it is a discrete thing.
Okay.
Maybe it's more accurate to talk about ecofascisms,
Okay.
because the term gets used in some pretty divergent ways, and I would say to date that none of them have kind of emerged as the central figure, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so ecofascism, for I think historically, has been just a pejorative term that someone who was maybe more aligned with market or industrial forces, who was trying to get, I want to develop this property, but there's a spotted owl on it that is protected, and this is ecofascism. Uh,
Yeah.
and in fact, I think it was in the introduction to the book. I'm not sure where I picked up this piece of information, but that Linkola was in fact inspired by the some of the environmental protections that were passed in the United States in the 1970s, like um, Endangered Species Act, and some of these things, which he saw as being uh, very definitely fascist. Like
Hmm.
that's a fascist thing for a government, or authoritarian, maybe a more accurate. Um, and that was kind of his inspiration to say, well, if we can do this,
Hmm.
like, what else can we do with this system?
Right.
Um, so I would say, number one, it's just kind of a pejorative that gets launched at anybody who is like, hey, maybe we should think about the watershed. It's like, we're trying to make a McDonald's here.
You fascist. Yeah.
Yeah, you
Hmm.
eco-fascist. So the second kind of loose definition is that, I would say that there's identifiably a variant of ultra nationalist white nationalism, which is preoccupied with this notion of the sanctity of the land and the people who inhabit that space, however it's defined naturally. Like, this is the people who belong here, and so that often comes with an agenda of vilifying immigrants and kind of more broadly, the demasculating qualities of industrial modernity, and so you'll have, kind of a survivalist. Some of your preppers and survivalists definitely fall in this camp. And then the third ecofascism that I think, and so first of all, that one specifically I think relates to Linkola's position, but he actually incorporates the third kind of identifiable strain, which is right now it's just a theoretical construct of an authoritarian government that strictly controls individual behavior in order to maximize environmental health and or remediation. And so I feel like that he is already, cleanly comfortable in the second camp, although he may not be politically allied with some of those organizations in Finland. I don't know. But that his program that he puts forth in the one of the essays really is a pretty clear example of the third, the authoritarian government too. So so that's kind of like my conceptual map of what ecofascism would entail. And so, to your point about the Venn diagram thing, it's like if you could imagine, a Venn diagram where you have deep ecologists and who are all left with that lingering question of by what means. And then in the other one you have, I would just say like ultranationalism, because any place, any ethnicity is capable of that kind of social expression. So it's not something that white people made up. Even if we really like it, so there's a place where that strain and the deep ecology overlap. And I would say that that is sort of the coordinate that we're trying to figure out, how cleanly does Linkola fit into that overlap?
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to things like he's certainly a nationalist. He cares mostly about Finland, and I believe part of his that amazing 20-point plan that he puts at the end of the book has to do with completely closing borders, right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely the nationalistic strain, but what's interesting about Linkola, I think, is his complete sort of disdain for any kind of democracy, right? Like, he definitely thinks that democracy was where things took sort of a bad turn. So while I feel like in America we would equate nationalism with sort of I don't know, maybe more American values like democracy or something, or maybe not, I don't know. But his disdain for allowing people to have a voice, I think, is pretty well summed up in this passage here that I had highlighted. He says, "Never before in history have the distinguishing values of a culture been things as concretely destructive for life and the quality of life as democracy, individual freedom, and human rights, not to mention money. Freedom here means the freedom to consume, to exploit, to tread upon others. All rights, even the most seemingly beautiful, women's rights, children's rights, rights for the disabled, only express one thing: me, me, me. Pure selfishness has been given a new name: self-realization, now considered the noblest of all morals. Words like responsibility, duty, humility, self-sacrifice, nurturing, and care are always spat upon if they still happen to be mentioned. So yeah, that pretty much sort of sums up how he feels about a kind of society in which people have the ability to have a kind of agency, I guess, within, well, not agency, but freedom, right?
Right.
And I think that I thought that that might be an interesting thing to kind of talk about, because that leads into, I mean, he thinks a whole bunch of very interesting things, and it's always dropped very kind of subtly. For example, Linkola would want, in his hypothetical perfect world, right? There would be this authoritarian regime, at least over, Finland, but in his ideal, it would be over the entire world. And we could just get into the dark part of it, I guess. He essentially thinks that everything up to 10% of the population needs to be exterminated. And
So,
go ahead.
um, there, I'd like to talk about liberal democracy just a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah.
Because he has a very specific formulation for his indictment of it.
Okay.
Or more specifically, I should say the liberal democratic experiment of multiculturalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So he's like, his argument is that it is irrational to try and extend kinship bonds beyond kind of a regional national level.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so to pretend, to say that we care about the nutrition and well-being, of a person in Kazakhstan
Mm-hmm.
is not just irrational, but it's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're making decisions based on the premise that we do and that we can, they are clearly poorly informed decisions. And he, and so there's an aspect of this argument that I actually find strangely compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And here is my reasoning. Although obviously I might have like a very different application or lesson that I take away from that.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we think about the development of human social systems over, a long span of time, a human span of time, we have, first of all, we have pretty clear evidence that cooperation was one of the fundamental human qualities that made us so adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have good evidence about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if cooperating on a kinship or extended kinship group had a certain degree of facility to it, then developing the social systems to organize human activity then on a city scale is the line at which we demarcate civilization, right?
Okay.
And then, I think it's Harold Isaac's Idols of the Tribe kind of takes us through this process by which, politically speaking or socially speaking, that growth from of social systems to include more and more people can be seen as a kind of evolutionary progression.
Yeah.
I'm more inclined actually to think of it as an expression of our efficiency at extracting and harnessing energy.
Okay.
And so where we see the greatest expression of that, broader sense of identity. So we might be talking about like, the Roman Empire or, different caliphates or, the Mayan Empire, where you really have large areas of land and diverse populations that are brought under, one social system. Those are always about the energetic extraction of energy from, if it's crops or, as you get into to the modern period into industrial processes, fossil fuels and coal and these things. So Joseph Tainter makes a pretty specific argument that the complexification of those systems are a product of energy investment. And so the process of collapse of those systems then is about the decline of energy available for investment. And so if you can imagine then, during the post-World War II industrial period where, all of this energy is just being used so intensely in a way that it never had in the course of human history, it only makes sense that our social systems would dramatically expand because of that investment. But now that resource is not as readily available for use specifically on building social systems, that universal sense of belonging starts to recede.
That's very that's interesting. That is really interesting to kind of link it to the sort of progress in energy production of an entire sort of group of people, and have that sort of equated to this, what we think of as maybe social coherence, right? Or social sort of belonging. And I think to pinpoint it at World War II is a very interesting and I think correct, because isn't that sort of like the last time that Americans kind of all felt united against a common enemy, right? Like, I feel like World War II, they were, more or less, right?
Yeah, I would definitely say that the 1980s, that there was probably the last time kind of a sustained national sense of unity, and not necessarily for good reasons. Like, I'm not saying that's magical and we should all, that should be something that we aspire to, but it's like as a fact. And then events like 9/11, we felt like that for a while. So it wasn't it was more like a burst that deeply changed the course of people's lives and the decisions that they made, and but it wasn't a permanent phenomenon. It was just a brief reminder of that kind of strong cultural unity.
Right.
So when I read Linkola writing about this and knowing that these ideas are gaining kind of traction in the broader social conversation, it's not to say that I don't aspirationally still feel that sense of human unity. What happens to people in Mumbai, like, it matters to me. But I can also understand why there might be segments of the population for whom that myth just holds no purchase any longer.
Right. Yeah, to kind of like sort of make your circle smaller and smaller and smaller. So there's actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because there are a lot of ideas in this book that I liked. I didn't necessarily like the conclusions that come from those ideas, but this is in particular one of them. The actual shrinking of social spheres into small groups, where I would obviously draw the line is that I wouldn't want that enforced. But I think that that's sort of moving forward into the future. Basically that idea, and again, less consumption. I feel like a lot of the things that Linkola talks about, I think I'm kind of bouncing around a lot here, but I think that Linkola he's a real grumpy guy, right? And I think that he presents a lot of really great ideas, but he has this idea that now, because there's 7 billion people on the planet, it's completely impossible to do these things. Right. And I think that he might be a bit constrained by his lack of actually having traveled anywhere, because I'm not sure he's ever left Finland.
Right.
and Finland is kind of his whole world. So
Right.
he's sort of hearing these stories about overpopulation and economic collapse. He does say in the book that he has traveled to, I believe, Russia and Sweden to look at their forests and things like that. But
Yeah.
I think that the issue really comes from him just kind of not understanding how sort of massive the Earth is, and how there is still a lot of room left to maneuver, even with 7 billion or 9 billion or 10 billion people, which again is way too many people, but it's not this kind of end of the world that he puts together. So I'll table that for just a second and say that I do like
Yeah.
his ideas of small groups. I do like his ideas of consuming less. I really like his ideas of eventually having a kind of relationship with the animals that you slaughter or that you use for their milk or what have you. I think that
Yeah.
that's probably that's goals, as the youth would say, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can jump in anytime, by the way, if you want to interrupt me.
Oh, no, no, I feel like you're right on point with that. And but it's valuable, I think, to again return back to this framework of deep ecology and ecofascism.
Yeah.
And to the extent that, Linkola articulates deep ecology, I agree with him.
Hmm.
And in so doing, am also left with the question of by what means,
Hmm.
and temperamentally, my answer to that is fundamentally opposed to his,
Right.
and that is, that is the degree to which, he expresses his eco-fascist tendencies.
Hmm.
So, if you think about fascism as, a top down um, imposition of, a certain set of behaviors, uh, then we can contrast that with anarchy, which says that any meaningful and lasting change happens at the unit of the individual working in sympathetic and cooperative groups.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so if you for a lot of his program, the parts that I think resonate with me that are actually deep ecological in their orientation, um, all of those things could be brought about voluntarily.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
and so this gets to a central question of what is the purpose of the state? And my particular position on that is, the purpose of the state is to protect property rights,
Right.
something that he's very concerned about in this essay. Um, the so one other thing that I think is is worth sort of putting out there as where we like. So the argument that I'm making is that Linkola is not actually consistent with himself, and that is what is ultimately the fatal flaw, specifically of this essay, "Can We Survive? A Model for Controlled Future,"
Hmm.
and that by mixing in sound, deep ecological principles with unsound eco-fascist tendencies, that ultimately he doesn't even agree with himself
Right.
about some
Right.
about some fundamental principles.
Well,
Um,
we can even just to interject really fast about him
yeah,
not being able to sort of agree even with himself. There's a bit in the book where he actually goes into some depth about infanticide and about how basically the population explosion is due mainly to the fact that, he talks about war happening. And when a war happens, a lot of men go to war and they get killed. But he said that doesn't really matter anyway, because there can always be like fewer men to seed the women to have the babies. So it's not something that can actually be solved. So he
right.
talks about essentially infanticide and forced sterilization, in order to keep the population down. And then he talks about like, okay, so then who can we get rid of? We can get rid of criminals, right? So he's pretty harsh about that. He's like, thieves up against the wall, murderers up against the wall, all these awful people up against the wall. People with mental disabilities, he wants to put them down as well. But here's my point. Here's where I almost laughed out loud, because there's this whole section about how, but you know who you don't want to kill are the really old people, are the elderly. So he has this whole thing about like how the elders are the smartest people in society, about how young people are essentially stupid, and you have to, against all odds, sort of like keep your elders, right? Use medical technology, because he largely blames doctors for the population explosion, but then he'll turn around and say, but doctors are great because they're able to keep the elderly alive so that they can continue sharing their wisdom. And it's like, yeah, when he wrote this, he was in his early 70s, maybe mid 70s. And it's kind of like, this is the problem that I always have with these ideas. Well, besides the barbarism of mass murder, right?
Right. If we set the genocide aside for a second.
Yeah,
you know.
if we just table the genocide for a second. But it's always like, okay, who gets eliminated? Them out there. Who gets to stay? Me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's never this kind of thing where it's like, where he's like, I will go the way of ancient Sparta, and when I hit 80 years old, you can toss me off of a cliff for the amusement of the masses or whatever. Oh, no. We have to keep the elderly because they're actually smarter than everybody. And it's like, oh, at times the man just seems really grumpy about stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to get a picture inside my head, I'm not too proud of some of the things that I think, but I've been pissed off enough to be like, you know what? I wished everybody would die. You know what I mean? But I didn't write a whole book about it.
Yeah. So, again, I feel like that there's a kernel of truth sitting at that at the center of that, which is that the way that our culture handles its aging populations is shitty.
Yeah, of course.
Just like the rest of our culture, which is mostly pretty shitty. So it's not any surprise that we've commodified aging and dying, and that the processes by which we socially deal with that are really just heartbreaking.
Right.
Like it's fucking awful.
Mm-hmm.
So from there, I'm like, yeah, man, we could do a lot better job, but I made a note in one of the earlier essays, not the ones that were, he writes, when the lifeboat is full, those who hate life will try and pull more people onto it, thus drowning everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Those who love and respect life will instead grab an axe and sever the hands clinging to the gunwales. And when I read that, I was like, yeah, and it doesn't surprise me at all that this guy cannot possibly imagine himself as the person who is trying to get onto the boat.
That's the fundamental break, right? Like he's always the guy who's in the boat.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
So, and that's that's super helpful. So that kind of comes up, over and over again. And even we'll get to the essay in just a second. I wanted to kind of put forward one other sort of component before we get to the essay itself, which is to talk about why this collection of ideas is so poisonous.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's as we're sitting here chatting about it, it's funny to me. Mm-hmm. Like the parts that are offensive are funny in a way, because it's so clear to me how it sort of diverges from something that's a reasonable suggestion, to the extent that I wouldn't be surprised if you also were left wondering several times, like, is this shit for real? Like, does he
Yeah.
actually believe any of this stuff?
Oh
And
yeah.
I think that's really dangerous
Hmm.
because that's not a knowable thing, or like he may not even know the answer to that question.
Right.
Like, how much of this is real and how much of this is like performance art
Hmm.
about and environmental performance art,
Well, to be fair, the Finns are not exactly known for their sardonic sense of humor. Um,
well, if they have a sense of humor, it's definitely macabre.
right.
and and
There's a bit in the book where he talks about his friend Joka, who's a fellow fisherman, and he says
yeah.
Joka, he was a big joker. Always he would have you doubled over with laughter, and I was just imagining like, what is that humor like? It's like, look, the fish is dead. Look at his eyes; they're so stupid looking. And then Linkola's like, Joka, you cad, you crack me up every time. Like they're not exactly so to your point about it, like is this like a performance art thing?
Yeah.
I would say
um
culturally probably no. Uh,
yeah, it's so, but let's extend some kernel of the benefit of the doubt and say that there's some element of, a
okay.
kind of Swiftian satire.
Okay.
uh Maybe.
Sure.
Who
No, yeah.
knows?
Yeah,
Post,
that's
post,
fine to
Postmodernism, all we can do is posit parallel realities which accrue, or whatever it is.
sure.
So but let's consider this through the lens that I think a lot of its potential audience might, which is uh, it's a potential audience faced with the very real possibility of dramatic and rapid social collapse.
Okay. Yeah. I'm with you.
Um, and and so if you're imagining like what's that going to be like,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and the answer is it will be like what someone creates in the absence of the preceding social system.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, if we think of social collapse as, sort of a fait accompli, that is going to happen, and that we can predict in advance what the pieces are going to look like based on historical precedent or current cultural context, or whatever lens that you might want to think about that. I think it's more accurate to assume that people will be working proactively to bring about their agenda.
Mhm.
And so the people who have made plans
Yeah.
are going to be at a competitive advantage.
Yeah. I see where you're going with this. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for example, let's take someone who has a more uh, benign view of the human presence on the earth, like Jim Bendel and his deep adaptation strategy.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there are four fundamental components or four questions that you have to ask in using the deep adaptation strategy, which is how do we keep what we want to keep, which is also a question about what do we want to keep. The second one is what do we need to let go of in order to keep things from getting worse.
Mhm.
The third one is what can we bring back to help us.
Well, no, what bring back from where exactly?
uh, Human historical practice. So
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I got confused there for a
yeah,
second. I got you.
farming with horses,
Got you. Okay.
metal working, canning and preserving, that kind of thing. And then more recently, he's added the fourth R, radical hope, and it's just the idea that there is once you get sort of through the five stages of denial about the the predicaments that are currently unfolding, you have to you can strive to arrive at a place where you can acknowledge your agency
Mm-hmm.
in shaping what it's going to look like,
Okay.
and that you may not always live to see the full expression, but it's better to do good than to do bad, because that's going to have an effect on how people live going forward. And what's interesting is that Linkola's program, as he puts it forward here, like does three of those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it fits it. So I'm saying, like, it is a deep adaptation strategy.
Right.
It's just not one that I want to be part of.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah.
like critiquing this thing and really pulling it apart and showing its inconsistencies, I think, is a tool that we can provide people in trying to assess what better strategies might be.
Yeah, no, I like it. Shall we move into the final essay
My
where he
my
sort of
lord, we have talked it up.
yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay, so it all kind of leads to this. Like I said, I recommend people, before we kind of get into it, this is a little review corner. I recommend people actually check this book out, read it. I think it has a lot of values in not only in kind of the ideas that it presents that are not genocidal, but also in the genocidal ones too, right? Uh,
Yeah.
the book really kind of made me um, it made me do a lot of mental lifting that I wouldn't have had to do if this was a book that I was just on board with all the way. I'm finding a lot of value recently in checking books like this out that I find kind of abhorrent in a way, or that I'm kind of radically opposed to. Uh, Mainly for the reason that you brought up just a few minutes ago, which is that I don't feel like you can actually develop an opposing strategy until you understand what the opposition is doing in the first place. And I feel like you can't get it secondhand.
Yeah.
As a subset to that, there's a kind of uncomfortable idea that I think we all need to think with, which is that people who hold views that we find abhorrent or just kind of evil might actually have something useful to teach us. And I think that we don't do ourselves any favors by keeping them at arm's length. I think that we kind of have to bring them in, at least to our own personal sort of mental circle, and really kind of grapple with them and reckon with them. So that's just my sort of little capsule. Like, go check out this book if you're so inclined, because I think it has value in those ways.
Mm-hmm.
But all right, so final essay. Rob, would you like to take the reins on this one? You can pick it up from wherever you may like, sir, because it's a dense one.
Yeah. So, you know, I think the probably a good analog that you could make would be to describe this as his version of Plato's Republic,
Okay.
right? So this is a utopian product wherein he gives himself all of the invisible power necessary to bring about change without resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I find it interesting. This essay was originally published in 1999, and he foregrounds climate change above all of the other environmental concerns that he has expressed through the course of the collection as the justification for his eco-fascist utopia. Now, I find this particularly interesting. A couple of months ago, you and I talked about a book called Climate Leviathan. It's a political theory of our planetary future by Joel Wainwright and Jeff Mann. And they kind of talk about likely socio-political responses to the progressive unfolding of climate warming, disruptions in the climate. And so Linkola's program that he puts forward here fits very comfortably in one of the four categories that they came up with, which was a kind of nationalist, authoritarian eco-state, or the idea that rather than the industrialized nations of the world sort of creating a global unified regulatory structure that was, draconianly enforced, that would happen on a national scale instead. And so that's what they call the climate behemoth. Mm-hmm. So his, he sort of kicks off his program talking specifically about curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Now he said that he said in the earlier essay about how the human population should be optimally reduced to about 10% of what it is now. But right. he opens this thing, and this just got me. Mm-hmm. He said a less ambitious program, which is the one that he's putting forward, only aims at the preservation of mankind and its few companion species, and that the present population would in this not be reduced to 1/10, but only stripped of about 2 billion people, and by the sole means of controlling human birth rates.
Right.
Which is all complete lies, because right. First of all, this is clearly not a deep ecological program, because we are concerned specifically, by his own admission, with the human population and its companion species. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is not a deep ecological.
It's not deep ecology. Yeah, exactly. He kind of directly contradicts himself, because in an earlier essay, there's a direct quote. I'm not going to look for it. I know I highlighted it somewhere, but he says deep ecology is about the whole, right? And it's the definition that you gave so well at the very beginning of this podcast, which is, it's about man and their companion species as, an equal fractal bit of a greater whole. Right. So, yeah.
So I love the fact that, first he's like, look, I'm a citizen of the real world, and I know that I'm never going to get you all to actually put the needs of the environment ahead of human needs. So I'm making this grand concession where we're going to organize all of this around human needs and companion species. But in exchange, I need you to think about the elimination of 2 billion people as being a more reasonable alternative than eliminating 90% of the population. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's a brilliant rhetorical strategy, because it's literally nonsense from beginning to end. But because of the emotional cadences that it hits, it feels like you're like, oh, well, okay, that's a compromise.
It's genocidal lowballing, right? Yeah. It's like, listen, okay,
we'll only genocide as hard as we need to.
Yeah, look, I want 90% gone, but because I like you, I'm willing to concede that we just get rid of 2 billion people. Yeah. And it's like, wait, hold on. When did we start making these deals, right? Yeah. I'm not on board with any of that, right? We're not having a discussion.
So, and he promises, he's like, hey, the only way that we're going to be bringing this 2 billion, we're not talking about marching people off the cliff. We're just going to get very specific about who makes babies and under what circumstances that they're allowed to persist. But that's actually not true either.
No, it isn't.
Because he's talking about people starving to death in places where food production can't sustain the population. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a conversation, but it's not one that I want implied into my assent. And the second thing is that medicine will intervene much less intensively to sustain and extend the lifespan specifically of children. So we're
Right.
talking about more children dying at birth or in early childhood, and that's just the cost of doing
Yeah,
business.
there's a chilling line where he says, while this might be objectionable to some, he's like, infanticide has long been practiced by human beings. It's just something that was, which is again, very, very nearly a Swiftian thing where you have to sort of step back and be like, is he serious? Is this a real thing? But yeah, so there's the infanticide, and also I think it's worth pointing out that there are several instances throughout the book, which I think I've mentioned before, that do mention uh, his sort of admiration for the gulag, for the camp, right? He
Yeah,
he he 100% wants there to be camps
yeah,
for criminals and dissenters and people who have overconsumed in their lifetime. There's a bit where he talks about like punishing them on the same sort of level, where you have
people
thieves
who
and
are yeah, people who are most responsible for the present economic growth and competition will be transferred to the mountains and the highlands to be re-educated.
there we go. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Yeah. So
I said, yikes! How many of them do we expect to see again?
right, exactly, for re-education, right? So he's he's
Yeah,
he's a fan of this,
yeah.
and I think that we can't really, I think we have to take him at his word because I think we're just so used to people not speaking this way, at least
Yeah.
in polite circles, that we almost believe that people don't think this way, but a lot of people really do. If
Well,
if you
and
gave them the reins, there'd be camps in the mountains for sure.
and also like you have to imagine a crisis environment that
Mm,
because whatever change comes, it's it's not going to be hashed out at a Democratic primary.
right.
It's it's going to be hashed out. I mean, like I I guess I'm saying like historically speaking, if we were prepared, socially, politically, economically, you know, virtuously to deal with this problem proactively, wouldn't we have started by now?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so then we're left to imagine, what kinds of changes are going to be put forward in crises. And people don't always make their best and most humane decisions about how to proceed from a place of fear and want.
Yeah. Yeah. So that being said, I feel like we've kind of, as far as like the listener is concerned, I feel like we've pretty adequately laid out Linkola's ideas and strategies,
Mhm.
kind of what he wants. So as a kind of to sort of like conclude on a higher note. So what
Mhm.
can we kind of take from this, and what can we actually extract from the text and bring with us in our own kind of like understanding that he's not wrong, that climate change is real, that constant consumption and overproduction and constant favoring of the market economy over uh, the stability of environments, all of that's real. All the
Yeah.
all the conceits that Linkola lays out before he kind of goes full Hitler on us are correct and true. Um, I think that the place to start, for me at least, was the idea of sort of gradually phasing out consumption as much as I
Right.
possibly realistically can on an
Yeah.
individual level. So oddly enough, I think, would you say it's accurate that if we took these ideas and, much to Linkola's probable chagrin, actually did individualize them, there might be something like a plan of action there?
Yeah. So, you know, I think that you can, setting aside his eco-fascist agenda, there is still some very well-informed, deep ecological principles that are on display. Um, I I believe that the section where he writes about the transition from electric energy to a combination of human labor and renewable energy,
Hmm.
that's the future.
Yeah, yeah. I think
Like,
things
full
getting
stop.
harder. Yeah, him talking
Full
about
stop.
having to use his scythe to cut down hay and then having to use poles to drag it, what did he say, 5 kilometers or something through the forest. I mean, that's where we have to go, right? Like everything just
Yes.
has to get a little bit harder. And he gives in another one of his strange concessions, he gives that as an idea to actually help the economy, which he's ostensibly against completely. But he
Yeah.
talks about a politician saying, somebody asks a presidential candidate or something, how do we create more jobs? And Linkola is right when he responds to this person who he's not really speaking to, when he responds, we have to just get rid of machines. Like people
Yeah.
have to go back to doing the work, and it's not as efficient and it is harder, but that's the answer. And he's 100% right. 100% right with that.
Well, and especially, if you think about all of the kind of anti-globalist protests that are coalescing around the world, and some on the left, some on the right, some with no political orientation that anyone can even parse out. That's a resonant message. Like, that's a message that people are looking for someone to articulate. Now, again, by what means?
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
have to continually come back to that. And so, um, my particular orientation is, if that is something about which I feel strongly, my first and most pressing obligation is to manifest it in my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And it has no meaning as a theoretical construct that's not brought about through what is it, praxis,
Yeah.
the
Right.
the actions that actually like represent
Mm-hmm.
um, those values. And then if you create communities of people who are committed to those values, then that can influence. So again, we have a bottom up strategy by which solutions are contexted for places and particular people, and not just handed down, um, because we are dying of top-down political social management. Like,
Yeah.
we're, or mismanagement would be a better description. He writes a little bit here about agriculture, and there was some interesting stuff in there, especially because like most of the book is about how there shouldn't be agriculture, and then he actually puts forward some pretty, what I would consider to be more sustainable food system ideas than what we're acting out now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, like, if the reader can come into this essay with a pretty solid understanding of what deep ecological principles are, or at least appreciate what its orientation is, so that when they're confronted by an idea, it's like, is that really necessary? It's like, it's not deep ecological, like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which I think is a valid and legitimate critique. And ecofascism, I don't think is a valid critique. Like, I don't think that it holds up
Right. Right.
under scrutiny. So
Yeah, unless again, what you can take from it practically is great too. I also think that, if you want to have a little Pentti Linkola on your shoulder, whispering in your ear about what you particularly should be doing, not what other people should be doing. But
yeah,
if you turn the eco-fascist lens in on yourself, if you want to, you know, uh, internally eliminate 90% of the population, for lack of a more pleasant
yeah,
term,
I
then I
like
think that
that.
that's fine. I think that's totally fine. I think that
And
as long as,
that's within your agency as a human being. Like, that is the
right,
person that you should be changing. Like,
right,
and it's a failure of the imagination, of Linkola's imagination in particular, that we can only conceptualize this kind of change as being handed down to us from a government which has shown no uh, utility at making non-damaging social systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like you're getting mad at your dog for eating trash. This is what governments do, man. Like,
Right.
so if you want to make these changes, many of which are sensible and wise, make them in yourself.
Man, I think that's a great note to end on. I think that leaves it on a very nice note. So, Rob, is there anything that you'd like to tell the people? Anything that you might have written recently that you would like for them to read, or any particular books that they might be reading?
Um, I always assume everybody's reading what they want to be reading right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I it, I did an interview with David Holmgren, who is one of the founders of permaculture. It's on the World Literature Today. It's worldliteraturettoday.org. You can look up David Holmgren, Holmgren. He had some really interesting things to say about kind of the converging crises of climate, greenhouse gas emissions leading to the climate disruptions, and then also declining energy, and how the convergence of those two things may shape the future. Particularly prescient because he talks in the interview about the fire season in Australia last year.
Yeah.
And I've been, quietly concerned and watching the fire maps in Australia
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
he's still there,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's a real problem. So
Mm-hmm.
so people can check that out. It's called Shouting for Less, was the name of the interview.
All right. Well, I will link that in our show notes. Mr. Rob Vollmar, it is always a pleasure to speak to you, sir.
Thanks, buddy. It was good talking with you.